Chicago, a city that never sleeps, was thrown into chaos on the night of Monday, February 5, 2024. The streets of East Chatham, usually humming with the quiet rhythm of urban life, became the backdrop to an act of violence so ruthless that it sent shockwaves through the entire city. A young police officer, barely 3 years into his career, was gunned down in cold blood. The suspect? A man who should have never been on the streets in the first place. A man with a history of crime, deception, and violent tendencies. Officer Enrique Martinez was 26 years old. A son, a fiancé, a brother in blue, committed to protecting the very streets that would become his final battleground. What was supposed to be a routine traffic stop turned into a fatal confrontation, a gunman's rampage that would leave 2 men dead and a city demanding answers. The shooter didn't just kill, he executed with a weapon designed to inflict maximum damage. What happened in those crucial moments? And how did a man with a long history of breaking the law find himself armed with a fully automatic weapon, ready to take a life without hesitation? The story doesn't end with the gunfire. What followed was an escape attempt so reckless it defied belief. A desperate run through the night, a forced entry into a stranger's home, and an act of defiance that left even seasoned officers stunned. The details of that night tell a harrowing tale of crime, consequences, and a justice system that many believe failed one too many times. This is a case that doesn't just demand attention, it demands justice. Officer Enrique Martinez wasn't just another name on a growing list of fallen officers, he was a young man with a future that stretched far beyond the badge he proudly wore. At 26 years old, he had already built a life dedicated to service, a career shaped by discipline and an unwavering sense of duty. He was engaged to be married, planning a future with the woman he loved. His family was no stranger to law enforcement. His brother, also a police officer, understood the risks that came with the job. But no one could have imagined that Enrique's name would be added to a tragic roll call of officers who never made it home. He was a son of Chicago, raised in a city that demanded resilience. Those who knew him described a man who wasn't just driven by the idea of wearing a badge, but by the responsibility that came with it. He didn't see policing as a job, it was a calling. In the 6th District, where he patrolled, he wasn't just another officer responding to calls. He was someone who saw the people behind the problems, who believed that the streets of his city could be safer if officers took the time to understand the communities they served. His belief in the good of people never wavered, even in the face of growing violence. Every shift came with uncertainty, but Martinez embraced it. He understood that every traffic stop, every call for assistance, could turn into something far worse. And yet, on the night of Monday, February 5, 2024, when he and his partner approached a suspicious vehicle blocking traffic, there was no way to predict that this would be the last call he'd ever respond to. Did he sense the danger in those final moments? Did he see the fear in his partner's eyes? Or was it all over before he even had time to process what was happening? His family's grief was immediate and immeasurable. A brother lost to the violence he spent his career trying to stop. A fiancé left with wedding plans that would never come to fruition. His colleagues, hardened officers who had seen more tragedy than most, stood silent, their pain evident as they gathered to honor him. The Chicago Police Department released a statement, calling Martinez a courageous hero who protected our city until the very end. But words, no matter how well-intended, could not fill the void he left behind. The loss extended beyond his family and fellow officers. A community that relied on men like Martinez to keep their streets safe now had one less protector. People often hear about crime, about police officers being killed in the line of duty, but rarely do they stop to consider the lives behind the headlines. What does it mean when an officer is murdered? What does it mean for the people they leave behind? And perhaps most importantly, how do we prevent the next tragedy? Officer Martinez's death wasn't just a loss, it was an alarm bell. A young officer, trained, prepared, and cautious, was gunned down in the middle of a routine stop. If he wasn't safe, who was? How many more officers would be added to the growing list of those taken too soon? The people closest to Martinez weren't just grieving, they were demanding answers. And those answers would start with one man, the man who pulled the trigger. But what kind of person was capable of such an act? Who was Darian McMillian? A man with a past filled with arrests and second chances. A man who should have been behind bars, but instead was roaming the streets with a weapon designed to kill. The kind of weapon that turned a traffic stop into a war zone. In the days following Martinez's death, the city of Chicago found itself at a crossroads. People wanted justice, but would justice ever be enough? Would the arrest of one man bring any real change? Or would another officer, another young man with dreams and a future, find himself in the exact same position? As the investigation into the crime unfolded, more disturbing details emerged. The gunman didn't just kill and run, he went to extreme lengths to evade capture. He forced his way into a stranger's home, ripped a tracking device from his ankle, and attempted to disappear into the night. What drove him to such desperate actions? Was he a man caught in the moment, or was this a calculated escape from a fate he knew was inevitable? The pieces of the story were coming together, but the full truth was still out of reach. The police, the prosecutors, and the people of Chicago wanted more than just an arrest. They wanted accountability. And as the case moved forward, one question remained. How had a man like Darian McMillian been allowed the opportunity to take another life? Monday, February 5, 2024. The streets of East Chatham carried the quiet hum of a city settling into the night. It was just past 8 o'clock in the evening when Officer Enrique Martinez and his partners spotted a black Ford Escape, its taillight broken, its registration fraudulent. The vehicle was double-parked, blocking traffic in the 8,000 block of South Ingleside Avenue. A minor infraction, hardly the kind of stop that should have ended in gunfire. But inside that car sat a man who had no intention of letting the night end with a simple warning or an arrest. Darian McMillian was seated in the passenger seat, his hands shifting as he moved a backpack from his chest to the floor. There were 3 people in the car, but it was McMillian who immediately drew suspicion. The officers had seen this kind of movement before, an attempt to hide something, to position a weapon within reach. When Martinez ordered him to stop, to keep his hands visible, McMillian made a choice that would change everything. The next few seconds played out in a blur of violence. Martinez, standing just outside the driver's side, had his weapon drawn, a precautionary move that would prove futile. The words barely left his mouth before McMillian reached into his bag, pulling out a .40 caliber handgun fitted with a deadly illegal switch. In an instant, a semi-automatic weapon became fully automatic, unleashing a storm of bullets. Martinez was hit 5 times. The first bullet struck his torso, but it was the final shot, a bullet to the head, that ended his life. His body collapsed onto the pavement, his gun falling from his grasp. In the driver's seat, McMillian's own friend was also struck. A man who had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time. His lifeless body slumped forward, a casualty of his friend's recklessness. The chaos had just begun. McMillian, knowing the weight of what he had done, didn't hesitate. He shoved his dead friend's body out of the vehicle and slid into the driver's seat. He had no plan, only a desperate need to escape. A backup officer, responding to the gunfire, lunged toward the open driver's side, grabbing onto McMillian's jersey in an attempt to pull him out. But McMillian was already in motion. He slammed the car into reverse, the door still ajar, dragging the officer along with him. The officer fired a single shot into the ground as he lost his grip and fell to the pavement. The Ford Escape swerved, tires screeching as it collided with a parked car, the force of the impact jarring McMillian forward. For a brief second, everything was still. The neighborhood, once filled with routine sounds of the city, now held nothing but echoes of gunfire and the fading roar of the engine. And then, just as quickly as it had started, the silence was broken by the sound of a door flinging open. McMillian wasn't finished running. He abandoned the car, bolting down the street, his white t-shirt stained with dirt as he sprinted toward a nearby apartment building. Inside, a woman was home alone, unaware that her night was about to be shattered by an uninvited guest. The door was no match for a man running on pure adrenaline. McMillian forced his way in, his eyes darting around the apartment, searching for something, anything, that could help him disappear. His ankle monitor, the very thing that tethered him to his past crimes, was still strapped to his leg. He needed it gone. He spotted a knife on the kitchen counter and grabbed it, sawing at the device with frantic urgency. The woman stood frozen, helpless as she watched him struggle. His voice was low, tense. "I need a sharper knife," he muttered. "I did something bad." The words hung heavy in the air. He didn't threaten her. He didn't raise his voice. Yet the fear in the room was suffocating. The woman, knowing she had no control over the situation, did the only thing she could. She waited. It didn't take long for McMillian to realize that his escape plan was falling apart. The police were closing in. Every siren in the distance was for him. His monitor, now severed, lay discarded on the floor. His time was running out. The streets outside were no longer empty. Officers moved swiftly, their eyes scanning every alley, every doorway. McMillian slipped out of the apartment, moving fast, vaulting over a fence, his breath ragged as he ducked into an alley. He still had the knives in his hands. His shirt, once clean, was now streaked with dirt and sweat. He had been running for what felt like an eternity, but his luck was running out. When officers spotted him walking on South Maryland Avenue, he barely looked like the man they had been chasing. His movements were slower now, his escape all but over. The weapons were still in his grip, but there was nowhere left to run. They ordered him to stop, their voices sharp, demanding. This time he listened. As he was cuffed and led away, the pieces of the night's events were still settling into place. But for the family of Officer Enrique Martinez, one truth remained: nothing could bring him back. The night was far from over. Officer Enrique Martinez lay motionless on the pavement, his uniform stained with blood, his service weapon untouched. His partner, still reeling from the sudden ambush, called for backup, his voice frantic over the radio. The crime scene stretched across multiple blocks, bullet casings littered the street, a crashed Ford Escape sat abandoned, and somewhere in the dark, the suspect was still running. But his freedom was fleeting. The call went out across Chicago's police radio. An officer down, suspect armed and dangerous. Every available unit mobilized. Squad cars tore through the city, sirens piercing the air, blue and red lights flashing in a desperate pursuit. Officers poured into East Chatham, shutting down streets, sweeping alleyways, and questioning bystanders who had witnessed the chaos unfold in real time. The city, for a brief moment, seemed to hold its breath. Then came the break. A woman, voice trembling, called dispatch. A man had forced his way into her home, grabbed a knife from her kitchen, and muttered words that sent chills through her. "I did something bad." She watched as he frantically sawed through an ankle monitor strapped to his leg, his hands unsteady, his breathing erratic. When he left, disappearing into the night, she was too terrified to move. The dispatcher stayed on the line, officers rushing to her location. They knew exactly who they were looking for. By the time officers spotted McMillian on South Maryland Avenue, he had already run himself into exhaustion. Dirt streaked his clothing, his white t-shirt now stained with sweat and grime. In his hands, he still clutched two knives, his last, feeble attempt at resistance. The officers approached with caution, weapons drawn, prepared for the worst. But the fight had drained from McMillian's body. He surrendered without a struggle. As they placed the cuffs on his wrists, the weight of what had just occurred settled over them. One of their own was dead, and the man responsible was now in custody. But this was only the beginning. Piecing together the crime. Inside the abandoned Ford Escape, investigators discovered the horrifying reality of what had transpired. A .40 caliber handgun, modified with an illegal switch to make it fully automatic, lay discarded inside the vehicle. 14 shell casings, evidence of the rapid gunfire that had torn through the night, were scattered across the seats. A dead man, the vehicle's original driver, had been left behind, his life taken in the same barrage of bullets that killed Officer Martinez. And then, a discovery that painted an even more disturbing picture. 2 baby bottles filled with lean, a powerful and highly abused prescription cough syrup cocktail, sat within reach. McMillian had been under the influence, his mind clouded by a potent mix of substances when he made the decision to pull the trigger. But what investigators couldn't ignore was his past, a history littered with violent offenses, missed red flags, and a system that had given him chance after chance. Months before the shooting, McMillian had already been on law enforcement's radar. In January 2023, he was indicted in Will County on charges of unlawful possession of cannabis and intent to deliver. Later that year, in October, he was charged again, this time for defrauding a drug screening test. His punishment? Electronic monitoring. No jail time. No real consequences. A man with multiple felony convictions was walking the streets with a device meant to track his movements, a device that he had no trouble removing the moment it became an inconvenience. But his criminal history didn't stop there. He had previously been convicted of aggravated fleeing and eluding. He had served 4 years for aggravated discharge of a firearm before being released in July 2023. And despite it all, he had somehow managed to obtain a machine gun-style weapon, a firearm so deadly that the city of Chicago had been desperately trying to get them off the streets. So the question remained, how was this man free? The justice system under scrutiny. Superintendent Larry Snelling didn't hold back in his frustration. In a press conference following the shooting, his words were direct and unwavering. "We have to do everything we can to keep violent offenders off the street, especially those who are repeating these acts. If we don't, we are failing our citizens. We are failing our children. We are failing their futures." And he wasn't alone in his outrage. In the days following Martinez's death, Chicago's police officers, prosecutors, and city officials were forced to confront a glaring issue. McMillian should never have had the opportunity to pull that trigger. He had been given second chances, leniency, opportunities to rehabilitate, and each time he had walked free, only to return to the same pattern of crime. The court system, designed to balance punishment with rehabilitation, had left an armed and dangerous man on the streets. And now, a police officer, a man who had sworn to protect the city, was dead because of it. The evidence against McMillian was overwhelming. Ballistics confirmed that the gun found in the SUV was the murder weapon. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses captured him fleeing the scene. The homeowner he had terrorized gave a detailed account of his desperate attempt to remove his ankle monitor. Officers who had chased him through the streets would testify to his reckless escape. And yet, even with an airtight case, even with the certainty of his guilt, there was still an uneasy feeling among those seeking justice. Because this wasn't just about McMillian. This was about how many others like him had slipped through the cracks. How many violent offenders had been released under conditions that did little to stop them from committing further crimes. How many more officers would be forced to pay the price for a broken system? The courtroom battle was just beginning. The prosecution would lay out their case, detailing the brutality of McMillian's actions. The defense would attempt to shift blame, to paint a picture of a man caught in a moment of desperation. But the facts remained unchanged. Officer Enrique Martinez was dead, and no amount of legal maneuvering could rewrite that reality. The people of Chicago were watching. The officers who had lost a brother in blue were waiting. And the Martinez family, shattered by grief, would soon face the man responsible for their son's murder. Would justice be swift? Would the weight of his crimes finally come crashing down on Darian McMillian? Or would he become yet another name in a system that had repeatedly failed to hold criminals accountable? The courtroom doors were about to open, and what happened next would determine whether the justice system had truly learned from its mistakes. The air inside the courtroom was thick with a tension that refused to settle. Every seat was filled. Rows of uniformed officers lined the back wall, their presence a silent testament to the weight of this case. In the front, the Martinez family sat motionless, their eyes fixed on the defendant. Enrique's mother clutched a folded photograph of her son in his dress blues, a stark contrast to the man now seated at the defense table, Darian McMillian, clad in a prison jumpsuit, his wrists bound in handcuffs. The room was silent as the judge took her seat, the proceedings about to begin. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. Every detail was methodically presented, the body cam footage capturing the chaos of that night, the forensic evidence that placed McMillian at the center of the crime, and the ballistics confirming that his illegally modified handgun had fired the fatal shots. They called witnesses to the stand, officers who had chased him down, the woman whose home he had invaded, the forensic expert who detailed the sheer firepower of the weapon he used. Every testimony painted the same picture. McMillian had been armed, dangerous, and utterly indifferent to the lives he destroyed. But it was the testimony of Martinez's partner that silenced the room. His voice was steady, but the pain was evident. He described the moment his friend fell, the helplessness as he watched Martinez's body hit the pavement. He had drawn his own weapon, but it had been too late. The damage was already done. When he finished speaking, the only sound in the room was the quiet sobbing of Martinez's fiancée, seated just feet away from the man who had stolen their future. McMillian's defense had little ground to stand on. They attempted to paint him as a man backed into a corner, a product of a system that had failed him long before that night. They pointed to his upbringing, the struggles he had faced, the circumstances that led him to that traffic stop. But the judge was unmoved. She had seen repeat offenders before. She had heard every excuse. The facts remained. McMillian had fired the shots, he had made the choice to run, and he had left 2 people dead in his wake. The final moment of the trial arrived with a crushing sense of inevitability. The jury, having deliberated for less than 2 hours, returned with their verdict. Guilty. On all counts. First-degree murder of a police officer. First-degree murder of his own friend. Attempted murder of another officer. Unlawful use of a weapon. Aggravated unlawful use of a firearm by a felon. The charges stacked like bricks, each one sealing his fate. The judge's sentence was swift. Life without the possibility of parole. There would be no more second chances. No more leniency. As McMillian was led away, he did not speak. He did not look back. The gavel fell, and just like that, justice had been served. As the courtroom doors swung open and the final echoes of the gavel faded, the weight of what had transpired remained heavy in the air. The sentence had been delivered. Justice, in its most legal form, had been served. Darian McMillian would never walk free again. But for those left behind, the conclusion of the trial did not erase the grief. It did not bring back Officer Enrique Martinez. It did not change the fact that a young man with a bright future was buried while the city continued its relentless cycle of crime and consequence. The murder of Officer Martinez was more than a singular act of violence. It was a reflection of a larger problem, one that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. The outrage that followed his death was not only for him but for the countless others who had lost their lives at the hands of repeat offenders. How had McMillian, a man with an extensive criminal record, been free to commit such a crime? How had the justice system failed to prevent it? These were the questions the city was left asking. Superintendent Larry Snelling had been clear in his frustration. The system, he argued, had given McMillian too many chances. There had been warning signs, glaring ones, but they had been overlooked in the name of reform, rehabilitation, or simple bureaucratic failure. McMillian had been caught with illegal firearms before. He had a history of violent crime. He had violated the terms of his release. Yet, time and time again, he was placed back onto the streets, where the cycle repeated itself. The result was deadly. And McMillian was not an anomaly. In Chicago, law enforcement officers had been sounding the alarm about the rise of illegal firearm modifications. The weapon he used that night, a handgun fitted with an illegal switch, was capable of unleashing rapid gunfire with the pull of a trigger. The black market for these modifications had exploded in recent years, making it easier than ever for criminals to turn simple handguns into military-grade weapons. Officer Martinez never stood a chance against the firepower McMillian unleashed. For Martinez's family, the fight for justice didn't end with the trial. His brother, still serving in the Chicago Police Department, stood at the forefront of a movement demanding stricter penalties for offenders caught with illegal gun modifications. The city saw a renewed push for mandatory minimum sentencing, with some calling for automatic 10-year sentences for possession of modified weapons and 20 years for discharge. But policies and reforms could only do so much. The deeper question remained: how does a city like Chicago break free from the cycle of crime and repeat offenders? How many more officers would have to be honored with candlelight vigils, their faces printed onto memorial plaques, before real change took hold? Officer Martinez was gone, but his name would not be forgotten. The trial had brought closure, but not healing. His family would never see him in his wedding suit. His colleagues would never hear his voice over the radio again. Justice had been served, but at what cost? The loss of Officer Enrique Martinez was not just a tragedy, it was a wake-up call. A city that had already suffered so much violence was forced, yet again, to confront a harsh reality.
Officers, present, armed!
Chicago police officer Enrique Martinez was laid to rest today. He was killed in the line of duty earlier this month, just 26 years old. Our Alex Miragos joins us now in studio to show us how he was remembered today. Alex?
Allison, Officer Martinez had been with CPD for almost 3 years, and many said today that his service to Chicago will never be forgotten. Hundreds of members of the Chicago Police Department stood outside in the rain outside of St. Rita's to honor the life of one of their own. Martinez was just 26 years old, shot and killed in the line of duty 2 weeks ago today while conducting a traffic stop in East Chatham. And while many lined up along the funeral procession route to pay their respect to the officer, others took it one step further by adding hundreds of blue ribbons and bows to the chapel's trees. His colleagues today, we heard from several of them during the funeral service, spoke of his distinct laugh, his love of animals, and his love of his job.
Kike was simply different from the rest of us. There wasn't a day where this guy was not laughing or cracking a joke. Even if his joke wasn't funny, his laugh would make you instantly laugh as well.
We lost a hero. Officer Enrique Martinez gave his life protecting our city. This is his day.
Was just a packed chapel there at St. Rita. The funeral procession then led family and close friends to a private resting place. There will be a benefit for the Martinez family from 7 until 11 p.m. Monday night at Cine Studios on West 14th Street. Just outpouring after outpouring today, especially from his brother, who was also a Chicago police officer as well. Allison.
Thank you so much.
Justice had been served in the courtroom, but outside its walls, the same dangerous cycle continued. How many more officers would be lost? How many more families would receive that dreaded knock on the door, their world shattered in an instant? Enrique Martinez was more than just a police officer. He was a son, a fiancé, a man with dreams beyond the uniform he wore. He should have been planning his wedding, building a future with the woman he loved. Instead, his family was left with memories, his name etched into a plaque instead of a marriage certificate. The city may move forward, but for those who knew him, time would forever be frozen on the night of February 5, 2024. His story is one of thousands. Across the country, repeat offenders slip through the cracks, walking free despite their history, despite the red flags, despite the warnings. And when the system fails, it's innocent people who pay the price. This case is closed, but the larger fight is far from over. So now we ask you, what needs to change? Should criminals with violent pasts be given second chances, or should the justice system be stricter in keeping repeat offenders behind bars? Should illegal firearm modifications carry harsher penalties? Where do we draw the line between reform and public safety? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you believe these stories need to be told, if you believe justice should never be ignored, then take a moment right now to like this video, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. These cases deserve attention. The lives lost deserve to be remembered. And the more people who hear these stories, the more voices we have demanding change. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. We bring you the cases that matter, the stories that need to be told, and the truth behind the headlines. Thank you for watching. Stay safe, stay informed, and we'll see you in the next one.